Hello, everyone. It's Professor Buzzkill here, busting myths, taking names. We're living in difficult times. We're living in times that try people's souls, as they say. We're recording this show on July 17th, a few days after the attempted assassination of presidential candidate Donald Trump, and also in the wake of one of the most important books in American history to come out in a while, The Field of Blood, Violence in Congress and the Road to the Civil War, which came out a couple years ago, but is still proving to be immensely relevant to today's politics. And so it's a very good thing for you that we have a wonderful historian named Professor James Welborn, who's on the line today to talk about his new book, brand new book, Dueling Culture's Damnable Legacies, Southern Violence and White Supremacy in the Civil War Era. Dr. Welborn, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm a buzz killer, as they say. I've been a fan of the podcast for a while, so it's part of my commute to campus 3 days a week. So I appreciate the work you're doing and getting great history and really sort of contextualizing a lot of what's going on in our current society historically and some great scholarship. So thank you for having me.
Well, this is great scholarship, and it really is contextualizing something that I thought I had already kind of known about. The idea of Southern honor, Southern manly honor, the moral element to that. I think a lot of people who read history sort of think they know that, but you go into such detail and broaden out the context that I think not completely, but I think very differently about it now. What first drove you to choose this topic and especially the place that you chose to do your case study?
That's a great question, and I'll try to be succinct in my answer, but I think, and I've said this elsewhere, but I think it holds up. It was a relatively simple question that I was initially asking, and it stemmed from I read a book called Old Strom about
Yeah.
Strom Thurmond. It was a biography. At the time that I read it, it was the published unofficial biography because Strom Thurmond was still alive and had not signed off on this biography. It was later published as the official biography after his death. But there was a line in that book that introduced Edgefield, where Strom Thurmond was from, Edgefield, South Carolina, and described it as a place that was more Faulknerian than Faulkner's Yoknapatawpha. And Faulkner was an early revelation for me. I was a dual history major and English minor. Kind of went, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, so I almost went the English lit route as a major. And so, not surprisingly, I sort of mostly do cultural history. So literature is still a big part of kind of how I think about history and people's conceptions of it. But that was fascinating to me. And then Jack Bass, who's the author of this book, quotes Strom Thurmond as saying, "Yeah, my father probably would have been elected governor, except one time he had to kill a man."
Oh, Lordy.
And it was just a throwaway quote to kind of sum up
Yeah.
this paragraph on how Faulknerian Edgefield County was. And so the question was initially, well, what's in the water in Edgefield? And the more I kept digging, the more layers I kept uncovering. So it's the self-proclaimed home of 10 governors, a very powerful place in 19th century South Carolina politically. A lot of very
Mm.
powerful people have connections there, kinship networks there. And so they punch above their playing weight, so to
Yeah,
speak.
because it's not that big. Yeah.
It's not that big. It was a crucial economic hub for the Midlands of South Carolina, and the upstate of South Carolina. It was kind of a funnel for a lot of the agricultural production in the interior part of the state to funnel it to Augusta and then down to Savannah. And then there's all kinds of
Hmm.
battles over controlling that commerce and keeping it in the state and building railroads from Charleston to Hamburg, which is on the north side of the Savannah River, to keep that business in South Carolina. So it's got a fascinating economic history as well as a political history. And so that was the initial question: is how do we explain this crucial, sort of prominent, conspicuous role that all these Edgefield men are playing in South Carolina and Southern history, and really on a national stage?
Yeah, and you show that it's what, as you say, the birthplace of Southern righteous honor.
Yeah, that's not a term that they would have used. It didn't
Mm.
find anybody describing themselves as sort of, emboldened by a sense of righteous honor. But to me, that made sense as a framing mechanism, as a more useful descriptive term for what they were evincing in their personal lives and in their public presentation. It was a sense of their cause was just, right? And the way they
Yeah.
went about defending it, even to the point of a lot of violent acts, right? Within the household and in very public places, this sense that it was indeed righteous, it was somehow divinely
Yeah.
sanctioned. And so that's eventually where I got. But in exploring that initial question of what's in the water in Edgefield, I really just got into the local archives. The best advice I
Mhm.
ever got was from Paul Anderson, who was my advisor at Clemson as a undergrad and as a master's student. So, I'm spitballing, I'm throwing ideas at him in his office, and he's like, well, "What about this Edgefield? Let's dig more into that." And so he said, nothing beats boots on the ground. It's great that you've got a good handle. The first thing I turned into him, the first chapter, I guess, of what became my master's thesis was basically a lit review of
Mhm.
honor and religion in the South. And he was like, "This is great. It's a good context, but nothing beats boots on the ground. You got to get down there." And so that's
Yeah.
what I did for the next year. Basically went down at least 3 times a week, sometimes as many as 5 times a week in the local archive. I got really close with the local archivists, the local director of the genealogical library down there, met some very prominent people in Edgefield who had private collections of primary sources and diaries and things. And so I spent a lot of time on the square in Edgefield. And one of the first things I did was get into the local newspaper, which had been in print since 1836. So
Wow,
it
that's
was a
early.
it
Yeah.
was a daily from that point forward. So the advertiser was the first place I went. Initially, I was just looking for sort of public treatment, commentary, editorials, reports, whatever, on these acts of violence, which I had a fairly comprehensive list of all the people and all the I had gone through the coroner's reports and sort of identified all these cases that had gone to court. But I wanted to see sort of the public view of it, right, as events in the newspapers. But as I was cataloging those, and I started to notice that a lot of times, often alongside would be advertisements for religious revivals. And, come
Hmm.
out to Mount Vernon on this weekend or on Saturday for religious worship services,
Mhm.
among Methodists or Baptists or whatever. Now, this is a strange dichotomy. And so explaining that really became kind of the point of continuing to dig. How do people
Yeah.
in this community, in a collective sense, as a communal whole, but also in an individual sense, how do they reconcile these seemingly antithetical things? The sense of masculine honor and the role that violence is very much sanctioned within that ethical mindset, and sort of the classic Protestant evangelical, especially turn the other cheek, restraint, curbing the passions. How do they reconcile that in their personal lives, and how do they do it in sort of their public positions?
Well, and you show that how this is done and years over which this is done means that it becomes, as you have titled your first part of the book, part one, a new Southern ideology. It is the combination of these things, merging the ethics of honor and piety in the early antebellum period, as is the title of your third chapter. So
Yeah.
I thought that was fascinating, a new Southern ideology.
Yeah, and I think the timing, obviously the context is everything.
Yeah.
There's an increasingly urgent need, as sort of perceived among white pro-slavery Southerners, to kind of shore up their moral and ethical foundations. They're increasingly sort of operating in this almost, I think I call it in the epilogue, a besieged mentality, right? Like
Yeah.
there's this sense that in a transatlantic sense, with the British Empire's abolition of the slave trade and sort of the growing anti-slavery movement in the North or outside the South, all of those things are increasingly vocal in their criticism of the racialized system of slavery as it exists in the South. And so Southerners, starting with, John C. Calhoun, James Henry Hammond, both of whom have Edgefield ties and are
Lordy.
connected through kinship to very prominent people in Edgefield. Francis W. Pickens, who's the first governor of South Carolina during the Civil War, is very, very closely related to some form of cousin. I haven't determined
Yeah.
exactly what their bloodline connection is, but I think it's very tight. And he kind of pulls a lot of the strings in South Carolina politics through those kinship networks. John C. Calhoun does.
Mhm.
And so, that shift from which we all know, right? I think most people who study early American history and especially Southern history and slavery, there's that shift from sort of an uncomfortable acceptance, necessary evil, as Jefferson describes it, to what Calhoun is really the first to vociferously declare a positive good, right?
Right.
And so the timing is everything because in order to make that stick, one, we've got to lay claim to a certain moral high ground, right?
Right.
So that's where Christian paternalism comes in.
Yep.
We are Christian masters. We are bringing these otherwise inferior enslaved people, this inferior race, into the light of Christ and civilization, right? That doesn't work if you don't, at least to some degree, pursue that
Mm.
end, right? But that doesn't work if the men in charge of that process sort of their own houses, if their own lives are in disorder. So
Right. 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 Right.
so
Yeah. Yeah.
they've got to sort of clean up the house of the self first. That
Mm.
was really sort of the crux, I think, of what I was trying to do by really drilling down deep into these hyper personal stories, because at the end of the day, that's the most important way in which people filter and understand and eventually engage with the sectional crisis is through these personal experiences, which are intensely emotional experiences. And so to try to capture the complexities of all those dynamics sort of at work in individual lives was really what the book became. It didn't really start out that way, but
Yeah.
as I followed the sources, that's sort of what emerged.
Well, then maybe in one sentence or two sentences. I mean, first of all, it's amazing. I'm amazed at historians who are able to plumb the depths of emotion the way you have in this book and to talk about emotion as an activating force here. But then how does this all, before the sectional crisis starts, which is part two of your book, what's the Wikipedia version of this new Southern ideology? Remembering, of course, that we have a lot of international listeners, so they're not going to know
Yeah.
a lot of things that you and I take for granted.
In a nutshell, and this is how I present it to my students, it's inherently masculine. That's
Right.
assumption number one that's undergirding this emerging sense of righteous honor, that patriarchal authority, male authority, is rightfully, in an ideal sense, the supreme authority in society. It's sort of the governing structure upon all which all else rests, right? And that's not new,
Right.
right? I mean,
No, no.
European societies are mostly patriarchal for, time out of mind, but that's a given. So we're assuming that male authority is supreme authority. In the context of the slave South, we're also assuming white supremacy. So a sense of racial hierarchy that places whites at the top of sort of the hierarchy of human civilization. And so combining those two provides the best, most sustainable social order in their minds, right?
Yeah.
If we're going to avoid social disruption, social chaos, we have to vest these particular men with supreme authority, and from that all else flows.
Right.
So that becomes increasingly difficult in the context of the antebellum period, in the context of anti-slavery movement that's questioning the racial assumptions behind that, in the context of the reform movements in which women are assuming a much more public role and sort of pushing the bounds of gender conventions and ideals, right? All of that starts to gain or garner criticism, right?
Yeah.
And so essentially what I'm arguing is that this early antebellum generation in the 1820s and 1830s is increasingly confronted with that criticism and feels the need to define themselves against it in defense of patriarchal and white authority. And so righteous honor emerges out of that as a way for these men to essentially claim the privilege and prerogative that a well-ordered society vests them with.
Yeah.
And so that involves personal piety. They're expected to control themselves and are uniquely suited as white men to do so, right? So self-mastery is the linchpin of the whole thing. And upon that cornerstone is their slave mastery, which is sort of the broader cornerstone of their social order. And in order to maintain both of those things, to assert their self-mastery, sometimes their prerogative enables them to engage in all of these different forms of violence to keep other people in place, to ensure that the whole apparatus doesn't become a house of cards and fall down around them, right?
Hmm.
And so
Yeah.
essentially that's what that first generation in the 1820s and 1830s, in the face of all this criticism, that's what they feel increasingly compelled to do. But they're also on the cusp of this transition, right? Because they had come of age, been in college classrooms and debate societies at a time when even white Southerners were more willing to at least engage in debate about the longevity and the sustainability and the morality of slavery. Their sons don't feel like they can engage in that debate without
Hmm.
losing the whole war,
Right.
metaphorical war of words, right? Without compromising their position in a sectional sense. And so they're increasingly defensive, and righteous honor becomes more assertive and, as I argue, more violent in its outcomes. Less prone to compromise, more prone to conflict.
Yeah, and the timing of that conflict and the intensification of that conflict comes during, what's known as the sectional crisis, the 1850s,
Yep.
something that most Americans only gloss over. Oh, yeah, Bleeding Kansas and a couple of other things, but it's
Yeah.
really, really crucial and really, really tense and violent and everything else. And the detail that you go into about that period is it's just fascinating in a horrific way, but fascinating nonetheless.
Yeah, and I think this is kind of where the sort of intensely personal and emotional study that I'm doing really, in most ways, corroborates what other scholars have said about political violence during this era, sectional identity during this era, especially Joanne Freeman in the book
Yeah.
you mentioned. But I mean, obviously, she talks about Preston, probably the most infamous act
Yeah.
of violence in Congress up to that point, right?
But by the way, tell everyone what that was, just so we'll
So
remind them.
that's really sort of as I sort of start the book there. In
Yeah.
May of 1856, abolitionist Senator Charles Sumner from Massachusetts gives a speech over the course of 2 days on the Senate floor, which he calls the crime against Kansas. He's referring to the violence that's broken out on the ground in Kansas between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces. So Americans are already actively shooting at one another over the issue
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
slavery on the ground in Kansas by May of 1856. And so he's decrying this state of affairs. How have we, as a civilized democracy, reached this point? And he's pointing fingers. He's very deliberately pointing fingers, using very controversial language and metaphor and imagery to essentially accuse the pro-slavery South as the white rapist of American
Mm-hmm.
civilization.
Mm-hmm.
It's somewhat of a mixed metaphor, because on the one hand, he's accusing them of themselves being the rapists, but on the other hand, he accuses them of sort of foisting this unclean woman, in his metaphor, slavery, upon the nation, right? So
Right.
if you really sort of scrutinize it, it sort of falls apart. But he knows what he's doing.
And it's a big deal speech. It's not only
Oh
two
yeah.
days.
Yeah, and
Everybody's
it's
there because
widely,
he's
everybody's in
yeah,
the
yeah, yeah.
chamber. All the powerful people in Washington are there. They hear it live. It's reprinted
Mm.
widely across the nation. And so Preston Brooks, long story short, one of the people that Sumner singles out in his speech is elder senator from South Carolina, Andrew Pickens Butler, who is Preston Brooks. Preston Brooks is a second term member of the House of Representatives. So he's a relatively new young congressman, but is a cousin of A.P. Butler.
There you go. That genealogical connections,
Yeah.
family connections. There, it's amazing.
Yeah, so it's I mean everybody in South Carolina politics is seemingly related in some way during this period. So Brooks becomes the, for lack of a better term, logical choice. All the Southern politicians are incensed that Sumner would deign to use this type of language and level these types of accusations against their state, their region, their project, their national project, right? Slavery for them is the path to progress.
Right.
So national prosperity is sort of grounded in the presence of a slave economy being enabled to expand and grow and continue to fuel the engine of American economic expansion, right? And so Sumner, in one fell swoop, is saying, nope, that is all bull. And the way you're going about pursuing that is heinous, morally corrupt. And so all of that, Brooks becomes the logical choice because of his familial connection to Butler. It's like, you've got to do something about this.
Yeah, yeah,
Like,
yeah.
this is your cousin. He's called him out. He's made fun of him. He's mocked his Butler, as an elder senator, had recently had a stroke. And so Sumner makes fun of the degree to which he has trouble. He kind of involuntarily just drools Like
Yeah.
he takes to walking around with essentially a small spittoon around his neck to capture his drool.
Yeah, we should remind people that Sumner wasn't necessarily the nicest guy either. I mean,
No, I mean
ridicule, ridicule
yeah,
things in a very bad way. Yeah.
not the first time that he had viciously personally attacked someone, right? He's kind
Right.
of
Yeah.
built a reputation on that. And so he knows what he's doing. He writes to a friend saying that I am going to pronounce the greatest Philippic that's ever
Yeah.
been pronounced in a legislative body. Like he knows he's pushing all the right buttons. He's trying to evoke a reaction from pro-slavery Southerners to expose the degree to which slavery has brutalized them to the point of violence, to the point where compromise is no longer possible.
Yeah.
And so Preston Brooks and the rest of the Southern congressmen who are in his ear obliged. They're like, yeah, we got to do something. We have to respond. This demands a response. And so the way that they respond is also very calculated and, as I argue, is steeped in the code of honor that governs masculine behavior. Brooks does not challenge Sumner to a duel because, in his view, Sumner is not worthy. He's not on equal footing, right?
That in itself, right there, is absolutely crucial to the understanding of this episode, and I think for you, it's chapter 6.
Yes.
You know, the fact that he doesn't consider Sumner worthy of dueling because he's not a gentleman and he's not moral.
So he, as is his prerogative, according to his sort of sense of righteous honor in this slave system, right? He administers corporal punishment.
Yeah.
Against someone beneath him. If Sumner's going to lower himself to the level of a slave, then I'm going to punish him accordingly.
Yeah.
It's a very deliberate act.
Yeah.
Even the way he goes about it and the way he talks about it after he writes to his younger brother in the wake of it to kind of recount what happened. And he describes it as 40 first-rate stripes, everyone laid on exactly where intended. So he's trying to project a sense of controlled violence, right? That he didn't lose his cool. He didn't become overly impassioned. Now, most of the bystanders and witnesses kind of call BS on that. They say he very quickly loses his cool and kind of gets carried away.
Well, but we need to tell the people who don't know what actually happened. I mean, what did he literally do? Oh.
He actually waits a couple of days. He wants to reread because he's only been told secondhand. Like he wasn't there, and he's not a senator. So he's been told. So he was like, "You won't believe what Sumner said today on the Senate floor." And so he waits a couple of days. He actually sort of waits outside the Capitol and initially intends to confront Sumner outside of the Senate chamber in his commute, essentially. But he's unable to do so for various reasons. There's some speculation among people who've really studied this event in detail. Peter James Hoffer, in particular, his book kind of gets into this a little bit, but the degree to which he's kind of waiting to make sure that what he says in confronting Sumner is well informed. So he essentially waits and reads it in the newspaper, the newspaper transcriptions of it, which on the one hand enables him to be more specific about what he's confronting Sumner about when he finally does so, but it also riles him up.
Yeah,
And it riles all the other South Carolina politicians who are in his ear. It riles them up. And so by the time he actually confronts Sumner, he basically resigns himself to having to do so in the Senate chamber. That's the only time he knows where Sumner is going to be.
Right.
And so he sort of arranges with other Southern politicians to enter the chamber, and they sort of keep everyone away while he engages in this. Initially, he just sort of basically says, "You've insulted my family, my state, and now I'm going to punish you accordingly," and then proceeds to beat him with what they call a gutta percha cane, a particular type of wood that has a little bit of elasticity to it.
Yeah, which makes it worse. Being hit by it. Yeah.
Whip-like, not, I mean, rigid, but also flexible and therefore more painful. All of which was very calculated, right? Yeah. But he almost immediately gets carried away. He ends up shattering the cane in multiple pieces, which he later references. He sort of calls them these fragments, which are begged for as sort of sacred relics among admirers of this act.
Yeah, slivers of the true cane.
Yeah, exactly. And so he quite literally beats Sumner senseless.
Yeah.
Sumner at one point, in trying to fend off the blows, tries to stand up. The Senate desks are bolted to the floor, so he partially pulls. Sumner's a big man. He's like 6'4".
Yeah.
And 25 pounds by most accounts. So a relatively large individual, especially for that time. So he tries to stand up, partially pulls the desk out of the floor, tumbles over unconscious. And then Preston Brooks leaves the chamber, sort of having made his point, done his deed. But going back to the speech that incited this,
Yeah.
according to Brooks and all the Southern politicians, Stephen Douglas is pacing. He's described by multiple people as pacing, the senator from Illinois,
Yeah.
pacing the back of the Senate chamber while Sumner's delivering his speech.
Yeah.
Some people describe him as pacing like a enraged tiger. He's just incensed. Like, what is this guy doing? And he reportedly, a couple of different counts said that he said, that damned fool's going to get himself shot by some other damned fool.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah.
One of my favorite quotes, and because I think it puts the finger on the pulse of what's happening in this moment, right? Like,
Yeah.
Sumner knows what he's doing, and everyone knows kind of what type of reaction it might elicit, provoke. And so Brooks ends up being the administrator of that.
Well, you see what's so fascinating about the way you describe this and the way I've always thought about it. Those two things are very different. I sort of always thought that Brooks just lost his temper and caned him right immediately, right? But all of this planning and thinking it out and talking with other South Carolina people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, kind of makes it slightly weirder. But then when you take your previous chapters into consideration and the buildup of this honor, it all makes sense because they all almost have to get together as the group of honorable South Carolinians and say, we have to do this, and it has to be with gutta percha, and it has to be blah, 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 blah. So it in my head, it was this, I'm sorry, it sounds like I'm exaggerating, Buzzkillers, but I am not. They're this clicking going off. Oh, I get it now.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome to hear, because I mean, that was the idea behind sort of structuring the book the way it ended up being structured. And it was actually a sort of a funny story. The structure in the sequence of chapters that ended up in the book was exactly what I submitted in more rudimentary form. It was that I fleshed things out, but exactly what I submitted for my dissertation. And then I had moved things around in answer to peer reviews at different points. It was like, well, maybe this chapter makes sense here to set the stage for this. And so we eventually came back to what the original, sort of this build up, this sense that these increasingly aggrieved and enraged Southerners are just tired of hearing it from everybody else, and they almost sort of explode in these increasingly violent acts. The buildup is to the point where they're exploding against their critics by the 1850s, and they're more likely to resort to violence as a first response rather than as a last resort.
So then, Professor, by the time the war breaks out, it's understandable why, after having read your previous chapters, it's understandable why you talk about the Civil War and the Reconstruction period as violent conflict as divine contest. By the way, you win the award for 2024 for having the best chapter titles.
Well, I can't claim all the credit for that. Nadine, my editor with UVA, was actually very instrumental in sort of helping me. I had a little more cumbersome titles initially that read more like essays, essays.
We tend to do that.
They were playing with, it was wordplay, and I was playing with imagery, and I think they captured, but they were overlong, shall we say. So she was actually great at distilling what I was trying to get at in my cumbersome way into sort of its essence. And so I'll give her a shout out.
But how were those two things, the war and Reconstruction, very important and there, how were they violent conflict as divine contest?
Well, part of the reason I structured that chapter the way I did is we often separate the war and Reconstruction, right?
Yeah.
And I think scholars of Reconstruction are increasingly sort of framing it as war by other means, right?
Right.
I think, but I think that's a relatively new direction in Reconstruction studies, sort of not talking about the post-war as something distinct, but really in a lot of ways, Southerners are just seeing the resistance to especially radical Reconstruction as just a continuation of the war. A paramilitary insurgency almost. And so to me, using this the Manly family, and really multiple members of the family, male and female, old, young, and because they're separated geographically during the war for long stretches for various reasons. We have a copious record of letters and diaries that they're keeping and writing to each other. And so
By the way, we should tell people that this family's name is actually Manly. We're not talking about the
Manly,
manly
yes.
masculinity, the honor,
Yes.
the
Yeah.
virility. Their name is
That
Manly.
was just it was too on the nose to that I was like, this can't be true. But yeah, one of those archival blessings, I guess. And Manly's a well-known figure in Southern history. I mean, he's at the forefront of the schism between Northern and Southern Baptists and the founding of the Southern Baptist Convention. He's been studied by a lot of people, but he and his son, who are both very prominent Baptists and Southerners, but sort of getting into their dialogue, it allows you to see sort of the emotional roller coaster ride that is the Civil War. I mean, initially they're gung ho. I mean, they've been pro-slavery Southerners. Basil Manley, as early as 1850, is advocating for Southern independence as the best means of securing their interests, as he phrases it, right? And he even claims later that as early as the nullification crisis, he was among the secessionists. That's a little more dubious of a claim, but somewhat personal revisionist history there. But the emotional roller coaster ride, I think, kind of encapsulates the complexity of the Confederate experiment, because initially there's a lot of enthusiasm, at least among the most ardent Southern sectionalists. But the travails of war, that again, very personal experiences of the war itself, lead to a much more complex relationship to the Confederacy, Confederate leadership, the Confederate war effort, and eventually to the results of that failed war effort, right? Emancipation and sort of reunion, or reconstruction.
But then how is it elevated to a divine contest, if you see what I mean?
So the Manleys are a very religious family. I mean, two of their sons and the father, the sort of head of household patriarch, are all Baptist ministers. And so they tend to view things through that lens, right? And so the war itself is initially sort of, in their minds, a divinely sanctioned activity, right? Our cause is just, therefore. Like, if all these things we say about slavery and our slave mastery are true, then our cause is just, and the Lord will favor us. But when the Confederate war effort begins to unravel, that doesn't hold up, right?
Yeah.
How do we reconcile defeat with? And so it becomes, God still favors us because God is testing us. He's punishing us for our waywardness, our sinfulness, the ways in which we didn't fulfill our duty as Christian masters. It's not that the system is wrong. It's not that God didn't necessarily sanction slavery as a divine institution. It's that we were not proper stewards of that. It's fascinating mental gymnastics to be able to make that transition in the midst of war. But that really continues into the post-war period, like how they eventually can get on board with resisting what they see as these egregious overturning of the proper racial order through radical reconstruction. They can take that basic premise and adapt it to this new context quite seamlessly, actually, because it's something they've been doing. They've been adapting their pro-slavery defense from the point necessary evil to positive good. Now it's not pro-slavery, it's a defense of white supremacy as social order, as a stabilizing factor. And so eventually that empowers the Jim Crow South and sort of the success of toppling radical Reconstruction and its racial progressivism, and a return to a very prescriptive racial system.
And then that leads on for the rest of the 19th century and almost all of the 20th century to what you call in your last chapter, the damnable legacies of righteous honor. This goes on for damn near another 100 years.
Yeah. It's not coincidence that all these Confederate symbols, from monuments to eventually flags, and these symbols of the Confederacy, are taken up by usually white groups, right? To assert a position of authority, a position of power in contest, counter to some perceived transgression, right? Or marginalization or threat. And it usually takes the guise of, and is presented as, a populist appeal, right? Like, you are threatened by these things, so if we band together, we can prevent these people from usurping your position, your opportunity, your whatever, right? And so who the target is changes over the course of the context changes, and so therefore the particular presentation, and but there are certain through lines that were striking from the way that white Southerners are rallying one another to the cause of slavery, and then in the post-war period to the cause of white supremacy and resistance to Reconstruction and racial progressivism. They eventually achieve that reassertion, right, through the end of Reconstruction and Jim Crow. And then in the face of the civil rights movement, it's a very similar appeal to white manhood, to whiteness.
The 1950s and 1960s civil rights movement.
And to sort of populism,
Yeah.
little p populism, that you, the working class white man of the South, or increasingly of America, right, are facing these challenges, are facing these potential losses, right? And so your only hope is to band together.
Yeah.
And so I think that was reflected the way I frame it. And I think there's a lot of recent scholarship that kind of corroborates this, that I cite in the epilogue, that these contemporary assertions of white Christian nationalism have a much longer history, especially as they're refracted through these personal experiences and these hyper emotional experiences. There's a lot of parallels, strikingly so.
Which, Professor, brings us right back to Strom Thurmond, who you mentioned at the very beginning. You know, certainly the most, well, maybe not certainly, but one of the most vicious racist and anti-civil rights people in Congress from the South and from South Carolina, and, well, who lived well into my lifetime.
Yeah.
You know, it was the face of the Jim Crow South for forever.
Yep.
Sorry, I don't know. That wasn't a question. I was sort of, you can spin on that however you want.
No, I think you're exactly right. My starting point in sort of going down this research rabbit hole and getting into the, for lack of a better phrase, into the minds of these pro-slavery Southerners, you're exactly right. I mean, Thurmond is, one, a product of that process, right?
Yeah.
I mean, as a collective group in the South, sort of the triumph of white supremacy in the form of Jim Crow, like he's born into and comes of age in that system, right? And then becomes one of its primary defenders when it's contested from various quarters in the 40s, 50s, 60s. But then he kind of repositions himself in the 70s and 80s and adopts there's kind of one of the through lines I think that runs through the book is sort of this tension that's always there between patriarchal prerogative, which most people generally, certainly during the 19th century, and I'd argue a large segment of the population well into the 20th, right? Assumes, right? It's a man's world, right?
Yeah.
As the phrase goes, right? That's a prevailing conception.
Yeah.
And so in order to assert that, he's drawing on these longer historical roots, this historical memory of the lost cause. Like as a white Southerner, he's particularly well suited, right, to make that defense. But he's also claiming that prerogative, but couching it in paternalistic terms, right? This is what's best for everyone. And we know because we are most capable of sort of fulfilling these ideals, right?
Yep.
And so therefore, logic tells you that we are also most capable of sort of instituting the greatest good for the greatest number.
Right.
Leave race relations to us.
It's just amazing.
Leave gender conventions and ideals to us, right? Like this is our area of expertise, and so he's a product of that. And so his latter career, he's not a race baiter anymore, right? But it's even more in some ways sinister, even because on the surface it's palatable, right? Paternalistic claims to, raising people up and helping people out of, these claims that I am particularly suited to help these other dependent, unfortunate groups, even though I'm still largely doing so in ways that reinforce patriarchy and white supremacy. And so that to me is one of the things that I think is most present now in sort of our current moment. Is that tension between patriarchy and paternalism is really at the core of a lot of our partisan debates, where people claim that, I'm not racist, right? Or because racism is a particularly egregious expression of hatred, right? As long as you're not riding around in a hood and burning a cross in someone's yard, you're not racist. Racism takes myriad forms, structural, systemic, down to personal. Oftentimes, sort of those claims that, American society isn't racist or I'm not personally racist hinge on whether or not you're engaging in these conspicuous, egregious forms of racial prejudice and discrimination. But often doesn't account for the more subtle, even sort of subconscious forms that it more often takes. And so that's what I try to get at and sort of situate in the epilogue, is that connection, that through line.
Well, Buzzkillers, the way Professor Welborn has just described the second half of the 20th century and into the 21st century explains so much. And he does the same thing for the period of his book, the antebellum South, the pre-Civil War South, and the Reconstruction period. It's just fascinating. Please go to the Buzzkill bookshelf. Dueling Cultures, Damnable Legacies, Southern Violence and White Supremacy in the Civil War Era is there for you to get ASAP. Trust me, it'll change the way you think about these things. And I just have to thank you, Dr. Welborn, for coming on the show.
Thank you again. This has been fun.
Yeah.
Maybe not fun to hear, but fun
Yeah.
fun to unearth all the, nefarious characters in the book. So thank you again.
Well, and I hope all of you dear listeners that, this is an example of perhaps the more we study violence and the more we try to understand violence, maybe more ways to stop it will come to mind and we can implement them and put them in place. So I'll talk to all of you next week.